All right, so this is manic.mercurian with your birth chart reading. This reading will be for Wednesday, April 6th, 1983 at 4:10 a.m. in Salt Lake City, Utah. Okay, so this means that you have Sun in Aries, Moon in Capricorn with Aquarius rising. And we're going to start out with some of the basics before we get into more specific parts of the chart and parts of your life. Okay, so first of all, Sun in Aries, this is a really strong placement. Sun is exalted in Aries. And so I think it's sometimes easy for many people and astrologers to oversimplify Aries. Aries is known to be very outspoken, very straightforward, very blunt, very gregarious, very ambitious, very energetic. They're typically, they're typically pretty straightforward and they're typically well understood by others. But again, like I said, this can be somewhat oversimplified sometimes, I think. Many Aries individuals don't always relate to the Aries archetype, and so that's where it's important to look to the rest of the chart to see what's going on. So you do have Mercury in Aries. Like most people who have Sun in Aries, you have Mercury there too. So the way you think and um, the way you process information is still like Aries. So this means that you're a quick thinker, quick learner. You probably thrive in new situations. But looking at some other placements, you have a lot of other energies going on as well. So Moon in Capricorn is very different. This means that deep down, although others may see you more as they may see your Aries side, especially in public or with friends, with acquaintances, with coworkers. They will know you as Aries. They'll know you as being charismatic, very straightforward, ambitious, all of these things. But those who know you more personally may know that you're actually very humble and very private at times, and that's the Capricorn moon. They may also know that you're very goal oriented and that you actually take your time, to go about achieving your goals, if that makes sense. So you probably have this other side to yourself that's much more thorough and gradual and careful than perhaps the way you come across when people are first getting to know you. Another reason why Moon in Capricorn is very different than Sun in Aries or Mercury in Aries is because Moon is in detriment in Capricorn. So basically, what this means is on the outside, people understand you very well. People tend to like you. You have this charisma about you, like most Aries people do, I would say. Um, but deep down, you can actually be very misunderstood. People may not always know the real you, and that's because part of having Moon in Capricorn is that you're very independent. You count on only yourself. You really don't put your baggage on anyone else. And so I admire that placement for that reason. But the downside of being so independent and, taking care of yourself, the downside of all this is that it can be difficult to form relationships because it's difficult for you to open up and to allow yourself to rely on other people. Um, of course, I think that's really admirable, but at some point, in order to have, especially very intimate relationships, we all have to kind of show our vulnerabilities, I think, and that may be difficult for you because it's just not something that you grew up doing. We'll talk more about your childhood later in the reading, but quick side note about Capricorn Moon is that they do typically grow up in very difficult circumstances, and that's where they learn to rely on themselves, not on others. So again, very admirable, but it is a difficult energy to work with. Um, and then again, I wanted to highlight one more time that because Moon is in detriment in Virgo, or excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. Because Moon is in detriment in Capricorn, where you have it, um, that detriment places are hard for people to understand. The way you process emotions, it's just different than how other people process them. You process them privately. You're not very, how do I put this? Like it may, like other people when they're emotional or having a hard time, they may be very expressive of it, and I would not expect to be very expressive of it at all, judging by your placements. Going through a hard time, you would really just keep that to yourself, and I would speculate you're probably very excellent when it comes to portraying yourself, as like everything's fine, I'm good, I don't need any help, and that part of that is true. You may not need help. You can do a lot on your own, but I think it's all about moderation. We have to know when to let people in, when it's safe to do so, when it's appropriate to rely on others, etc. Things like that. Judging by your placements, you probably have a very strong, independent streak, and that's excellent. That's a huge strength for sure. Both Aries and Capricorn, although they are very different. And real quick before I get too far into this, you do have a lot of energy in Aries and Capricorn. The Sun and Moon are so strong for all of us. So that's why I'm talking about them now. So Aries and Capricorn, although they may be very different, and therefore, although you may have very different sides to your personality, there are some common threads there. Both are very independent, both are very ambitious, both have very high standards for themselves. So these things would very much apply to you. You're, probably very hard on yourself, very much focused on, improving things, improving yourself, always working on that next goal, that next, goalpost, so to speak. And then again, very independent and probably a little bit stubborn too, because when you know what you want, you're set on it. That's what I want. It's very black and white. I would speculate that much of your approach to many things is black and white. And I think that kind of simplicity can be very effective because by making things simple, that's what allows you to be so confident. And that's another point too. Confidence is associated with both Capricorn and Aries. Aries is more of an outward confidence. Capricorn is more of an inward confidence. Aries is very expressive. Capricorn is much more withdrawn. And you are both, just in different ways. It actually works kind of nicely that Sun is in Aries for you and Moon is in Capricorn, because that means on the outside you come across as very expressive, but then on the inside, that's where what's private you keep private basically, and what's not private, you're very expressive about and can share that kind of energy, if that makes sense, with other people. Okay, another thing we haven't talked about yet is Aquarius rising. So, having Aquarius rising, this means that Saturn is your chart ruler, and this means that you are born to be a leader. You want to be a leader. This fits very well with the placements we've already talked about: Aries Sun, Aries Mercury, Capricorn Moon. These, especially when combined with Aquarius rising, all of these point to you being a leader of some sort. You want to be that person who's the experienced one, and I think that's a role you take on very naturally. You have the confidence, you have the experience, you have the foresight. You're always, again, you're very goal oriented and thinking about the long term, thinking about what's next. So to me, that's the first thing I think of when I see your Aquarius rising in relation to your other placements. That you are born to be a leader. You definitely can handle that level of responsibility. Aquarius rising also means you think very holistically. You're always thinking about not only the long-term effects of your actions, but also the effects of your actions on other people and how that fits in with the entire picture. I think thinking that way places a lot of responsibility on yourself, but it's excellent, for handling responsibility, basically. So this means that this just adds to many components that I think indicate that you likely have very excellent potential with being a leader, for sure. What else can I say? Let me just kind of look around here to see where else I can go from here. One thing I'm kind of holding off on talking about, because I like to keep these things compartmentalized a little bit and keep these things into neat little chapters, but we're going to talk in the career part of this reading about your reputation, because your midheaven is kind of on fire with Jupiter and Uranus there. We'll talk about what that means. But that adds to the likelihood that you are an excellent leader. And this does apply to the general personality as well, that I think we'll talk later about how that applies especially to the professional realm of things. But even just in your general life, I think you would be seen as a leader, even maybe with your family or friends. You're that person that's very confident, that knows what to do next, things like that. I keep, sometimes like themes like that will keep popping up in multiple parts of the chart. So that's something that I'm seeing for you. What else can we talk about? South Node is at 28 degrees Sagittarius, and it's conjunct Neptune. That's pretty interesting because it indicates that you may have some kind of psychic abilities. I actually find that very interesting because, for one, I rarely get reading requests from people who have Aries Sun. I'm actually thinking about going back and counting up, all the different sun signs of people because I do find it varies pretty dramatically. But I did find it was interesting, just looking at your sun and moon placements, that you'd be interested in something like astrology. I could definitely see how you'd be focused on self improvement, and so that could maybe bring you there. But looking at your south node, that's where things get very interesting to me because your south node not only is conjunct Neptune, it's also conjunct the galactic center. Um, this basically means that you have a very high likelihood of having some pretty intense psychic abilities or psychic experiences. I think this would be most likely or strongest in your youth, but this would apply to your entire life as well. But especially in your youth, I would be surprised if you didn't have some kind of psychic ability, psychic experience, maybe very vivid dreams. Some people with South Node conjunct the galactic center report having dreams being in alien bodies or visions of other lives. A lot of things that can apply to like extraterrestrials, like alien encounters or experiences, things like that. For you, I think this is strengthened because South Node is conjunct Neptune as well, so that adds in a lot of intuition and being able to tap into the collective consciousness or having visions, dreams, etc. A lot of really high psychic potential there for sure. What's even more interesting is that all this is in your 10th house, your south node and the galactic center. They're in your 10th house, at the top of the chart. In other words, they're at the top of the sky when you were born. So this means that these kind of psychic phenomenon or the psychic potential that you have, it's something that's very visible. It's we may like these things to be more private in our lives, but for you, it's not going to work out that way necessarily. It's going to come to you in a very public way. So you may have some kind of psychic experiences or powers in public or at work or what else? Some kind of experience that happens to you in public. Again, this could have happened in your younger years, but also the rest of your life as well. And this could have to do with your career as well, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. All right, let's get into the next kind of chapter here. Let's talk about your childhood, life challenges, your past lives, things of that nature. So while we're still sort of on the South Node, let's talk about your past lives because that's really, at least in my experience and my knowledge, the South Node is the one placement that gives us the most information on past lives, and everyone wants to know about their past lives. So for you, again, South Node is at 28 degrees Sagittarius. It's not shown here on the chart, but the reason why I know where it is because your North Node is at 28 degrees Gemini. South Node is always exactly opposite the North Node. So your North Node is 28 degrees Gemini. Your South Node must be at 28 degrees Sagittarius. Okay, so let's just first focus on that, and then we'll talk about the conjunction with the galactic center and Neptune. Okay, so just South Node in Sagittarius, this would say, well, it could say a lot of things really. This says that in a past life, you were someone who dealt with many different kinds of energies, different kinds of people from different socioeconomic classes, or people who had different beliefs, different mannerisms, different cultures. So really, this could be a lot of things. Sometimes people say Sagittarius has to do with a business person. So you could have been someone who was a trader or a merchant who dealt with many different kinds of people who maybe traveled for work. Sagittarius also has to do with the traveler for sure, or it can also be religious, like clergy, things like that. All it, but at its essence, at its core, it just has to do with someone who travels very far, or has experiences that broaden the mind, basically broaden the soul. So often that is physical travel, but it could just be traveling, through books, through information, through stories. Some kind of exploration, though, some kind of expansion of the mind and soul. That's what you mastered in a past life. So the way that actually looks, it could be very different. You could have been a priest or a monk or a traveler, a researcher, a business person. It's hard to say exactly what it is. But, again, astrology is all about the themes. The one theme I can say for sure is that you are someone who was, became very broad-minded, like the well-traveled person who, is familiar with many different customs, many different ways of living, things like that. That's the theme that you kind of mastered in another life. So coming into this life, you're very confident about what you believe in. So much so that you may be, I don't want to say a preacher necessarily, but you speak with conviction. And this also adds to what I was talking about earlier. You have a lot of placements showing that you're a strong leader. Um, but South Node in Sagittarius shows not only strong leadership potential, it shows that you really want, you're a truth seeker. You want the truth, and you won't compromise with anyone on that. If you know what the truth is, that's that, and everyone needs to know. They need to know the truth. So there's a lot of power there. So much so, in fact, that you have the nodes in domicile actually, which means that they are very naturally strong. You don't really have to develop them a whole lot. Okay, but something you do maybe need to develop though is shown by what the North Node is. South Node in Sagittarius, North Node in Gemini. So North Node in Gemini is showing that it's more difficult for you to meet people halfway. If you know what your truth is and you're confident about that, then why should you have to compromise with anyone? Why should you have to water down the truth? That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is you have to meet people halfway in order for them to understand you. Other people may not always be ready for your truth. There could be other ways of looking at things. So, it's important to know your audience and, speak in a way that they'll understand. And, you may have to, come halfway or even a quarter of the way for them to be able to receive your message. And that's where, on an even deeper level, I think, if you know the truth and you have such strong convictions, if you've made some kind of breakthrough in philosophy or information, again, suggested by your South Node in Sagittarius, it's actually sort of your duty to speak in a way people understand in order to spread that message. If you come across too strong and won't meet people halfway, you won't entertain their way of seeing things, they may not be open to your message, and then you will have not actually shared your message. You won't have shared that truth. So that's where, in sort of a backward way, if you really want to share that truth that you're passionate about, you must be open to others as well. I know this sounds a little bit lectury, but that's kind of how this part of the reading always sounds. These things are just suggested by the nodes. And I always, at this point, kind of look to your birth date, because these are things that we develop with. So much of this you probably already know, and you've probably made, I would speculate you probably made a lot of progress in this area already, if you know what I mean. Typically, we kind of have a breakthrough with this sort of thing at age 18 or around there. And when I say breakthrough with this sort of thing, I mean with the lessons of the nodes. That's because we typically have a nodal return, the transiting nodes return to the place they were at when we were born. This happens around age 18, so typically we make a lot of progress right at that time. And then every 18 years, this will happen again. Anyway, I don't want to get too far into that. Let's talk more about some kind of challenges and things that you're working on in this life besides, becoming more flexible, becoming more open to other people, things like that. Another one is, again, something I was kind of touching on earlier. South Node is... Oh, okay. I think I just realized something. South Node is not just in Sagittarius for you; it's conjunct the galactic center and Neptune. So it's showing that you come to this world with this really excellent spiritual intelligence or spiritual abilities, psychic abilities. Again, it's something that has always been there with you since childhood. So I think that that's what you're wanting to share with people, something related to that. Your point of view, your abilities, your consciousness. Something about that is special in the sense that it is otherworldly, or some would say supernatural. I think that's the thing though that you want to share with other people. So that's where I think what the nodes are saying is, if you present that in its raw form, people will not be ready for it. They won't understand it. They may be, with their current beliefs or their current perspective, they may just shut off if you present your gift or your information to other people. That's not at all to say that what you're offering isn't of value. It's just so different from what people are used to. They don't understand it. They can't receive it. So that's where I think North Node and Gemini is showing, get back to the basics, kind of simplify things. You don't have to water down your message in order to do this. Just, understand where people are coming from and how to speak to them, basically. How to, what is their language? And I don't just mean literally, but, metaphorically as well, I guess. Okay, since we're talking about kind of challenges here, let's, I also look to Saturn as well. The nodes are great at showing what you come into this world great at, as well as what you're focused on learning. Saturn, you may already have some knowledge of astrology, but in case you're not already familiar, Saturn typically shows what we are not so great at early in life. We have a rough time there. It's real hard. That's why Saturn gets a bad rap. It's typically having to do with things that are straightforward. They're easy to understand, but they are challenging. They don't come to us naturally. Wherever Saturn is in our chart, over time, we typically, not always, but we typically rise through, we overcome the trials and tribulations. And with time, those challenges become experience, and that experience becomes wisdom. So over time, those challenges are actually very valuable because they are what make us so great in that area, and then eventually we can actually become an expert or a leader in that area. So for you, Saturn is very interestingly, I think, in the 9th house in Scorpio. I should mention at this point I am using equal houses. I do that for all my readings. Okay. But Saturn, I would always mention it at this part of the reading, but it's especially important for you because it's your chart ruler. Your ascendant is Aquarius, and so traditionally that is ruled by Saturn. So this just means this is a very important part of your chart. Not only does this mean that you are likely to be a strong leader, but specifically Saturn is in 9th house Scorpio. I think combining the themes of Scorpio with 9th house to me points to truth seeking, especially in the sense of really deep, like occult truth, hidden truth, philosophy as well. These things you may have a very challenging time at early on. Another way of looking at this too is Saturn is in Scorpio, which has to do with intimacy. We talked about that earlier, how, it's common for people with Capricorn moon to, it's kind of like a give and take sort of thing. If you're so great at being independent, then you're not so great at being with other people. Does that make sense? So Saturn and Scorpio, that's very common to have, issues being intimate. That could be sexual. Scorpio does have a lot to do with sex, but it's also just emotionally intimate in general. It's hard to let people in, especially if you've had a kind of traumatic or very difficult upbringing. It can be very difficult to trust people or to allow yourself to be vulnerable around other people. So, a lot of dark, kind of heavy stuff, but that's what's to be expected with Saturn in Scorpio, I think, especially early on. This is going to be really kind of rough and challenging at first, but over time, this does tend to get easier. And judging by your chart and judging by kind of just the feeling I'm getting, I'm speculating that you're the kind of person that, you are seeking improvement. You're seeking self-improvement. You want to find the answers. You want to figure things out. You're a truth seeker. So you don't necessarily mind looking at some things that are pretty dark or even ugly if it means improvement and understanding. So I think, that's what Scorpio in 9th house, or excuse me, Saturn in 9th house Scorpio is all about. Focusing on the dark, but in order to understand it, then it doesn't have to be so dark. What else? I think I kind of covered it. It's pretty straightforward. It's definitely not easy to do, and it takes a lot of time. But Saturn in Scorpio, it'll just take time as you get older. And again, you probably have already made a lot of progress in these areas. You probably know a lot of this already, but over time, it will become easier for you to know when to trust people, when to rely on people. It'll become easier for you to be intimate with people when you want to, if you want to. And it's all about, keeping your strengths. really independent. You can keep that. You can find, a relationship, and we'll talk about relationships later, but not just romantic, but in general, you can find situations where you can reach certain levels of intimacy with others, naturally. It's just not going to happen naturally or easily early in life. At least that's what I would speculate based on Saturn and Scorpio. If anything, you may have traumatic experiences or just be very closed off from other people early on. Um, what else? Yeah, and then the only other way I could really see this is Saturn. Ninth house has to do with higher learning. So I think it's kind of interesting. So early on, you may be closed off not just to other people and intimacy, but also to higher learning as well. Occult information, philosophy, different ways of understanding the world, basically. All of this is going to be really strong, increasingly strong for you with age, basically. Um, you know, these things tend to get a lot easier after you reach age 30. I know you've already reached that point, obviously, but we tend to kind of struggle up until that point, but it gets easier as we get older. And then by age 60, when you have your second Saturn return in the late 50s, actually, that's when you really become kind of an expert. You've done the work, you've gone through the trials and tribulations, you've climbed that mountain, so to speak, and that's when you can be a mentor, you can be a leader. So again, a leader in maybe information, deep understandings of things, philosophy, but also in intimacy as well. What was so difficult for you early on, you become kind of self-taught, and I think that's what makes the expertise so rich and so valuable for others. Okay, moving on though. So let's see here. We talked about challenges. We talked about your past life to some extent. Let's talk about your childhood. So I can see a little bit, from a person's birth chart about their upbringing and their childhood. We talked about a little bit of that already. We talked about I definitely some strong psychic potential for you early in life. This isn't something that I think would necessarily be developed, although you can develop it and kind of, develop it as you get older. But it's something that would come out strong from the get-go, from day one. From a very young child, you'd have this, these strong abilities. And these things would likely come to you from a past life or maybe multiple past lives. There's something that they've already developed for you before this life, and that's why they're so strong early on. Also, even like a more shallow take of that would be South Node in Sagittarius means that you may have traveled a lot as a kid, or at least been around a lot of different information, different ways of looking at things, different beliefs, different societies, different ways of living, things like that. So there's this kind of double-sided coin of being very confident about what you know to be true and very set on that, but also being very open to other cultures and other ways of looking at things. I think these things actually go hand in hand because, it's only by trying so many different ways of living or thinking about so many different ways of understanding things that you become so sure of yourself because you've seen it all, all the different ways to look at something, if that makes sense. Okay, anyway, but these are all themes that would be very prevalent for you as a child, though. Let's see, we could also talk about your IC in Gemini. It's that little black triangle at the base of the chart, in case you're not already aware. So it's very common for people with IC and Gemini to have very vivid imaginations as children, and they often they tend to talk to themselves a lot as children because they have vivid imaginations, but they also often end up alone a lot as children. So they often have imaginary friends or talk to themselves, things of that nature. There's this really strong, chatty and energy that comes with Gemini. So you may have been a chatty kid or at least wanted to be chatty as a kid, but you may have had kind of limited opportunities with that, if that makes sense. What else can we talk about? Moon and Capricorn, I kind of touched on. Very common for people with Moon and Capricorn to either have a lot of responsibility placed on them at a young age, or they can be kind of neglected or abused even. Moon again is in detriment in Capricorn, and Moon, besides just having to do with our emotions and the core personality, it also has to do with kind of our upbringing and our mother as well sometimes. Typically the Moon likes things to be very soft and kind of very warm and cuddly, but in Capricorn, Capricorn's kind of a cold sign, so this means that you really weren't uh, what's it called, mollycoddled as a child, or coddled. Things weren't all soft and cozy for you. Things weren't provided for you. You had to kind of learn on your own. So typically people with Moon and Capricorn either have parents that are negligent, abusive, or they may have been loving, but they may have just been very stern with you. There can be different situations there, but either way, the result is a child which at a very young age has to kind of learn how to take care of themselves. And that's where this really strong independence comes from. Not just physically taking care of yourself, financially taking care of yourself, but also, especially, I would say, emotionally taking care of yourself as well. And that's where, to speak subjectively, I find people with Moon and Capricorn to be very admirable, but I do think it's a very difficult energy for a person to deal with. This also, like I think I touched on this, but another kind of side effect of having Moon in Capricorn is that you may not be understood. It may be difficult for you to have, intimacy or very strong, close relationships, because that softness isn't there. You didn't have that softness growing up, and so it's just not familiar to you as when you're getting a little bit older. Typically, though, like with all Capricorn placements, this gets easier over time, and they say that there's typically more of a kind of sense of humor that develops for people with strong Capricorn energy over time. You can actually kind of lighten up a little bit, loosen up a little bit over time, not be so serious or rigid, if that makes sense. So it may be easier for you to let other people in as you kind of mature and get a little bit older. And again, this is something that you've probably already experienced and made a lot of progress with. Okay, one thing we can look at is, well, actually, since we're still talking about the Moon here, Moon is also in the 12th house. It's kind of straddling the line between the 11th and 12th houses, actually. But Moon in 12th house often indicates that the psychic abilities you have came from your mother's side of the family. So it may be something that kind of runs along that side of the family, your mother, or any other kind of women on the mother's side of your family as well. Or just your mother's side of the family in general. So maybe your grandmother or your mother or both, or any kind of aunts that you've had, things of that nature. I guess I don't have to explain to you what that means, but yeah, I find that to be interesting, and I've found that to be very true with multiple people. Another thing, though, that's a little bit darker is that Moon is in detriment in Capricorn. Moon is in the 12th house, which is all about kind of isolation. It can be very depressing. There can be mental instability there. And Moon often represents the mother. So I definitely don't wish this to be true, but your mother may have had a hard time raising you, or she may have been depressed or isolated. She may have had some deep struggles with mental health. And I think this can often go hand in hand with those psychic abilities and with that intense empathy or the intense dreams or visions or whatever it is. I think having more on your plate in that manner can make it harder to deal with reality. There can be depression and isolation that come with those things. So I just want to point that out, because Moon in 12th house and Capricorn shows, for you, it shows very strong psychic potential, but for your mother, it looks difficult and kind of dark for her. So I hope that's not the case, but I figured I would kind of throw that out there. Let's see here. Also, since we're talking about Moon in 12th house, this means that, well, especially since Moon is in Capricorn, this means that at a young age you felt that you couldn't express yourself, like you, especially emotionally, you had to keep those things private and hidden away. What I've learned through these readings is that people with Moon in 12th house, it actually varies pretty dramatically why those people didn't feel that they could express themselves. It could have just been that you had very I don't know, very strong personalities in your family that kind of overrode your emotions and feelings, or could have been people being dismissive of your feelings, or could have been a lot of things. I don't want to say every different, can also be intense trauma that results in you keeping these things to yourself. But whatever it was, you felt like you weren't allowed to have your own feelings. Like you had to keep that hidden, keep it locked away, pretend it wasn't there. So although this is very difficult, especially early on, um, over time, this will and probably already has developed pretty significantly. Especially, getting into your late teens and your 20s, that's when those emotions that you suppressed for so long tend to come up again. You tend to become more aware of them. And that's where something really interesting happens, because once you become aware of those emotions that you suppressed, all of those things about yourself you put down into your own subconscious. So once those things come back up, they rise up to the surface and you become aware of them again, you would now, you're now not only aware of your own emotions, but you're also aware of your own subconscious. And so that's where there's this really high amount of self-awareness that comes from this placement with time. It's not usually there early on. Maybe it was for you with, these placements indicating your strong psychic ability. I'm not sure. But definitely, it happens at different ages for everyone. But definitely, late teens, 20s, definitely by early 30s, you would have this, what I would say, you would likely have this really strong potential for having a deep amount of self-awareness. And with that deep self-awareness comes deep understanding of other people as well. So you'd be very empathetic, as they say. You'd be an empath. You understand other people very well. They may not always understand you, especially deep down. They may think they do. Your Aries placements show that there is a part of you that's very easy for others to understand. But Moon in 12th house Capricorn, very private, very hidden, very deep as well. Very deep person. So not everyone will understand that. Not everyone will be open to that. Not everyone is seeking that depth, and that's okay. You know what I mean? Okay, one more thing, talking about your kind of childhood, though, your upbringing. So I know this is heavy stuff, but I think that's okay. So we can look to the angle that the sun and the moon make to one another to see some insight on your upbringing as well. So for you, sun and moon are square to one another. It's not exact. It's there's definitely some, it's a wide orb, I guess we say in astrology. But I would say, though, it was still part of that third quarter moon phase when you were born. So with sun and the moon at kind of odds like this, at an odd angle, this would mean that your parents were likely very different from one another. They may have not always gotten along. They may have expected different things from you. Even hypothetically, if you grew up with one person or one parent, they may have had a lot of contrast within themselves. And so that's where, as a child, it's very confusing. Like I said, you don't know what's expected of you. And although this is very difficult, it creates this ability for you at a very young age to understand multiple perspectives, looking at one thing from multiple different ways. So this is really great for understanding complex concepts. It's also great for being empathetic, understanding, even if you disagree with someone, you can still see where they're coming from. You can see it from their point of view, if that makes sense. So that is very difficult, again, but also very useful. I do think it's also interesting, being born near a third quarter moon, this phase of the lunar cycle represents a crisis in consciousness. So this is difficult, again, for you, because it means that you have very different sides of your personality, Aries and Capricorn. How do you balance both of those in one person? One is so fast and so immediate. One is so slow and gradual. They're similar in the sense that they're very independent and goal-oriented and all that, but they're different in how they go about those things. And so having both within you, that's very difficult to manage that level of contrast. It's also very, very strong if you can balance those things, but learning how to balance these different energies takes time. Okay, but something I've been trying to get at is being born on a third quarter moon. Third quarter moon is one of the most philosophical parts of the lunar cycle as well. I already said it kind of represents a crisis in consciousness. It's the quarter moons that the action happens, the change happens. But the third quarter moon in particular is less physically oriented than the first quarter moon. So what I'm trying to get at is with the being born at the lunar phase that you were at, this is something that also indicates strong psychic potential. So the more I look into your chart, the more I keep seeing factors indicating strong psychic potential. And again, just for the record, I want to list them off real quick. So South Node in Sagittarius conjunct the galactic center and Neptune, Moon in 12th house, and Moon squaring the Sun. All these things indicate a really deep personality, understanding deep concepts, being attracted to metaphysics. So now it makes a lot of sense why you'd be attracted to astrology or other occult information as well, spiritual things. I don't want to get too deep into all that, but it shows all these things show that things that may be too weird for other people, that would turn other people off, you'd be very open to strange information, experiences, people, etc. Okay, let's move on to the next part of the reading because this is getting really long actually. So okay, so what kind of job would you be best at, or what do I see you kind of doing there? What would you be good at? What would fulfill your needs in a career? So this is something I noticed right off the bat. The main placement we look to see, your reputation, your career, things like that, your relationship with the public would be the midheaven. So your midheaven is at 11 degrees Sagittarius. Having midheaven in Sagittarius, this is a fire sign. It's ruled by Jupiter, so it's a very strong personality, a strong energy. So this means that you are very you could be very personable in public. You can have a very strong reputation. As if this weren't enough, midheaven is also conjunct Jupiter. So this just blows up this energy even more, makes it that much stronger. So this means that you have this really strong fire, the strong charisma, strong presence. Sagittarius is known for being, again, it's like the well-traveled sign, so it's known to be experienced or wise, as well as personable. So there's many different facets here. So basically, to me, this looks like you have a very strong personality in public and at work. Uranus is also within range of this conjunction with midheaven and Jupiter. So this means that whatever you do, whatever public image you have, whatever you do for a career, it's going to be something very unique to yourself, something kind of revolutionary, something where you're something inventive, something that you've created on your own, or maybe you've taken something that already existed but really twisted it in a brand new way, something like that, if that makes sense. This also means that you may be seen as very eccentric. You definitely have a strong personality, a strong character in public and at work. So you're known to be quirky, to be different, to be very unique, to have unique viewpoints on things, unique information, unique mannerisms, things of that nature. So that's kind of just general information about your public personality, I guess. Talking about what you should do with a career, though, I like to basically just almost do a recap in a way of just what are your skills here. So the main things that really strike me about your chart in terms of your skills is, for one, the authority. Definitely, you definitely look like a leader doing something on your own, maybe being a manager, a leader, CEO, business owner. You have the drive, the independence, the ambition to do something on your own, to be that top person that has all the responsibility on their shoulders. You have the foresight as well. What else? Okay, and then the other main strength I see is that psychic ability. There's this really strong intuition there, and I don't know exactly what it is. I'm sure you know what it is when I talk about it, but I don't know what it is for you personally, but I think there's some kind of really strong, I don't know what to call it, like strong awareness. It could be an awareness with other people, or an awareness of philosophy or information. I don't know what exactly it is for you, but I know that there's something there that's very strong, that's always been there for you. So combining that with your authoritativeness, that's what strikes me as gold in terms of your career, your public, image, things like that. And this is kind of just strengthened even more by that conjunction with Jupiter and Uranus on the midheaven. This shows that you have that strong personality, that strong outlet for doing something on your own. So honestly, I don't know exactly how to combine those things. Like I said earlier, it's all about the themes. Putting it in 3D reality can be a little bit more difficult, because I think part of that too is because it depends on free will. What you choose to do with these themes is up to you. I don't know that, but if I had to speculate, um, it's hard to say really. I don't know. You look like you could be some kind of psychic or something, or um, this is gonna sound silly, but what it really makes me think of, and I know this probably isn't the case, but it sounds like you'd be some kind of like TV psychic personality. Like I think that would perfectly fit all your, maybe not all your abilities and personality traits, but many of them. Being someone who's, in the limelight, can handle attention, known for your uniqueness and some kind of unique gift that you have, if that makes sense. So that may sound far fetched. I'm not saying you're literally, occupying that kind of role. I'm just saying that would, check all the boxes of the themes that I see you embodying in that manner. Especially if it was something where you were like running your own TV show or something like that. Like you weren't, something where you're not just the personality, on the front of it, but also the one running things behind the scenes as well. You have, the brains and the brawn to do both, so to speak. So hopefully that makes sense. I know this probably isn't helpful for actually figuring out like what you should do, or maybe it is. I don't know, but that's what I see though. One thing too, I think it's interesting that all these more outer planets were at the top of the chart, top of the sky when you were born. Jupiter and Uranus specifically are conjunct the midheaven, but also Neptune, Saturn, Pluto, they were all kind of at the top of the sky when you were born. So this means that you're. This is actually pretty crazy. So this means that your public image, reputation, all of these public spheres of your life are going to be channeling in energies from the outer planets. And as you get outward into the solar system, the energies of the planets become much more abstract, much more spiritual, much more ambiguous and holistic, and I think more difficult for us to understand, because they don't apply to our immediate consciousness. They become much more far-reaching. I almost said far-fetched, or far, global, or things like that, if that makes sense. So this is just one more thing that points to you having this very unique, very strong, almost kind of otherworldly presence. That strong authority is definitely a big part of it with that strong Saturn, that, the chart ruler. I think having Saturn in Scorpio is kind of perfect for you because Scorpio is authoritative and strong, but it's also a water sign, so it does have to do with emotion and intuition, psychic abilities, things like that as well. And then we combine that with, again, the conjunction with Jupiter and Uranus on the midheaven, the eccentricity, the personality, the energy. And plus, this is all kind of contained by Pluto and Neptune as well, just channeling in more of that otherworldly, spiritual kind of energy. So, really interesting stuff. I hope you find this as interesting as I do. Okay, let's talk about the more romantic part of your experience, at least what I would speculate based on your placements here. Okay, so for attraction, desire, your approach to relationships, and as well as who you should kind of best be with, what I see your ideal relationship looking like. For all this and more, we look to Venus, Mars, and the descendant. At least I do. I don't think other astrologers maybe take the descendant into account as much as I do. I'm not sure, but that's what I do anyway. So Venus and Mars, I say they really embody what you're attracted to. That may or may not fit with what you need in the long term, kind of. That's how I simplify it. For you, it's pretty straightforward because Venus and Mars are in the same sign. They're both in Taurus. So this basically means that you'd be attracted to someone like Taurus, someone who's very stable, consistent, grounded. They could be a little stubborn at times. They're hardworking. Someone very practical. Someone no nonsense. They are what they are. What you see is what you get. With Taurus. So that kind of simplicity, that raw authenticity, that kind of practical, salt of the earth, so to speak. That's what you're wanting. That's what you're attracted to. That's what kind of turns you on. You want someone just stable, who they say they are, basically. I think this works really well for you because you have moon in Capricorn, which is very similar energy. So this means that anyone with strong Taurus placements, not only are you going to be very attractive to them, your approach to relationships will work with them. um, your sexuality, sexually would work very well with them as well, since your Mars is in Taurus. But also, since you have Moon in Capricorn, you're going to relate to them on a deep level as well. So that would really apply to people with strong Taurus energy. But Capricorn as well. Capricorn and Taurus are so similar, being so down to earth, so practical. Um, this shows you definitely have some strong attraction and compatibility with earth signs in general. I would say mostly Taurus and Capricorn, but it could be Virgo as well, since Virgo is also earthy. Definitely checks a lot of those boxes too. I think Virgo would be more of a stretch, since it's not. I think it's a little bit more different than Aries. It doesn't fit with Aries as well as Capricorn or even Taurus would. Okay, so right off the bat, definitely a lot of attraction, a lot of compatibility with Taurus for sure. Okay, but let's look to the descendant. So descendant is in Leo. Um, if I were to generalize and just say what one placement I would look to for long-term compatibility for everyone more than any other, I would say go with the descendant. I think it's that important. So for you, Leo was on the descendant on the western horizon when you were born. So this means that, well, at least the way I see it is, having Aquarius rising, you may not be the leader or the instigator of the relationship. You're definitely strong-willed. Aries Sun, Capricorn Moon. Yes, Aries Sun, Capricorn Moon, Aquarius rising. All these point to you being a very strong-willed individual. You have strong beliefs, strong expectations for yourself as well as others. But what's interesting about Aquarius rising in relationships is that although you do have very strong beliefs or strong standards for yourself, you're not necessarily the instigator. So you're a leader in the sense that you have the strong values and everything else, but you may not always be a leader in the sense that I don't see you instigating things as much as the other person, especially in the early stages of the relationship. It may work more naturally for you to be with someone who is more fiery, like Leo. So that's where the Leo descendant comes in. Someone who is more takes the lead, makes the first move. Someone very fiery, very confident, very outgoing, outspoken. The thing you would have in common is that you're both very strong personalities. The main difference is that they would be the person who's more maybe physically active, who makes the first move kind of in a direct way, if that makes sense. So a more simple way of putting it would be someone with strong Leo energy. It's just going to be sort of an opposite attract relationship. I think it will also work very well because you have Aries, Sun, and Mercury. So someone who's very fiery, outgoing, charismatic, has a very strong personality, they're going to work with you because not only would that be very complementary to what you are, but also you are those things to some extent as well. You are outgoing, confident, fiery, etc. So Leo, I think, would work pretty well for you. And of course, that's a huge generalization. We have to look to all the whole chart to really understand compatibility. But descendant is in Leo, so that's generally the best partner you would work with, not just romantically, but if you have to work one-on-one with someone, Leo, you're just kind of synchronized with Leo, I would say, more than any other sign. Even your Venus and Mars in Taurus work to some extent with Leo energy because they're both in fixed signs. They do square one another, so this means that you may not always agree with Leo people or people with Leo energy, but you'll at least respect them, you'll understand them, and vice versa. So definitely Leo, that consistency, that confidence, that energy, that I think is something that would fit very well for you. Um, and we can also look to the other signs of the same element. So Aries, of course, it has enough in common with Leo that it would fulfill many of the traits that the descendant shows that you're seeking, if that makes sense. So in other words, Aries would work very well for you as well since it's similar to Leo. Plus, you have Sun and Mercury in Aries, so dealing with another person who has that same energy, it's going to be very easy for you. You're going to relate to each other very well. Um, I also find that if you relate a lot to each other, you'll not only be. It usually creates more of a friendship dynamic. So I think it's very convenient the way your chart is situated that someone with strong Aries or Leo energy will not only be a strong romantic candidate for you potentially, but could also be strong friends with you as well, which I think is part of long-term compatibility too. For that matter, same is true of Taurus. What we were talking about earlier, Venus and Mars are showing romantic attraction there, but because your moon is in Capricorn, that's such a similar energy. Someone who's earthy, could be your friend, but could also be more than a friend as well. So earth or fire, by far, I see you being very compatible with and seeking, especially Capricorn and Taurus for earth, and Aries and Leo for fire. Sagittarius, it doesn't strike me as immediately or as strongly for romantic compatibility, but you do have your south node there, so this does show that you could relate very easily with people who have Sagittarius energy, or strong Sagittarius placements, and because your south node is in such a unique kind of place, someone with that energy may help you to understand your own past and your own psychic abilities as well. So you could have some very important and interesting dynamics with Sagittarius people throughout your life. And maybe even something more, maybe a romantic partner too, but it just doesn't strike me as much as Aries or Leo or Capricorn or Taurus. Those are what you're attracted to, what you work best with in the long term, and they're what you are, Aries and Capricorn. So it would be an easy, very natural kind of dynamic there. But let's kind of briefly talk about the other elements too. So let's talk about the air signs. So those would be Aquarius, Libra, or Gemini. You do have Aquarius rising, and what I find is that when you're with someone who has the same element as your rising, you have a lot in common. You tend to be friends, but unless the other placements are in a certain way in both of your charts, um, if someone, like for instance, if someone just has a lot of Aquarius energy, you will be friends. There's not going to be much more than that because it's like two of the same sides of a magnet, if that makes sense. Like you're both negative magnets, for example. Although you may have a lot in common, there's not that opposites attract kind of dynamic there. And there are some definitely exceptions to that for sure, but that's what I would generally say. Something interesting though is that you generally lack air energy. There aren't, for planets, you just have Pluto and Libra for air. Um, so Aquarius you may kind of relate to as friends since your rising is there. Gemini may help kind of teach you something since your north node is there. They may help show you something, or you may learn just by being around them. Pluto's in Libra, so that could be a little bit more intense for you. But as a whole, air signs, they're so kind of light and up in the air, so detached. I think you in general are not very detached. You are very passionate. You're very in the moment. You feel things very deeply. And so I think air signs to some extent could be a little bit off-putting for you, that you can't really pin them down. You can't figure out exactly where they're at because they are kind of always changing. They don't take anything too seriously. I think you would take things a little bit more seriously since you have that strong Aries and Capricorn energy. So air signs could be a little bit difficult for especially strong long-term relationships. On the other hand, though, there could be some attraction there because, excuse me, there could be strong attraction because we can attract the element that we lack in our own charts. That's where like for example, lacking air in your chart, things can feel so heavy, so serious, so rigid. Being with someone who's airy, they may have strengths that you don't, and vice versa. You may have strengths that they don't. You just have so little in common that it can be attractive, it can be elusive, exotic. You may be attracted to one another because each of you lacks something that the other has. They can show you how to kind of lighten up and see things outside of the box, maybe, or not take things too seriously. You can show them how to be a little bit more down to earth, more, take things seriously. Like, let's, be passionate about things. Don't just roam around all detached. You know what I mean? Get a little bit more structured, for example. That's what you could show them. So it can be a very complementary dynamic, but it depends on the ability of both of you to understand your stark differences, basically. And that's where I say, there can be some really interesting experiences there. It can be fun. It can help both of you, but it's going to be difficult for a close long-term relationship, in my opinion. Okay, and then lastly is water. Same kind of thing here. There's really, I would say you lack water energy more than any of the other elements. Um, there's hardly any placements there other than Saturn and Scorpio. So again, opposites attract, but that depends on you understanding each other's differences. Water signs are very sensitive. They're very emotional. Because you have strong Aries and Capricorn energy, I would speculate, you tend to be a little bit blunt and straightforward. Let's say things as they are. Let's put it out in the open. Water signs may not always enjoy that, directness. They are sensitive. You know, Sometimes it's okay for them for things just to be implied and not be, I don't know, so blunt maybe, and it can be sensitive, so they may be potentially offended by too much directness, I guess, if that makes sense. Um, and all in all, there's just a lot of differences there. So it's just another thing where you may help each other, but the potential of a strong, close, long-term relationship with someone who has a lot of water in their chart, I just don't see it so much working out, really. All else being equal, I guess. Okay, so at this point in the reading, I like to just kind of look around, touch on anything that I may have glossed over or not had a chance to talk about. I'm looking around and I think I covered most of everything, but let me just make sure here. I think I pretty much covered what I want to say. So, of course, I'm always open to questions, or if anything was unclear, or if you wanted me to, explain more or delve more into anything, I would be happy to do that. Or if you have any feedback as well, I'm always open to that as well. But yeah, very interesting chart for sure, especially with all that kind of psychic stuff going on. Um, I don't want to pry, but that is, there's definitely a lot of interesting kind of placements there for that. Okay, but yeah, thanks for this opportunity to read your chart, and have a great day.